My uncle told me, she left too soon, but she left you ready. At the time, I didn't understand, but now, every memory of her feels less like a goodbye, and more like the beginning of who I was meant to become. The first thing I remember was the silence. Not the kind that feels peaceful, but the heavy kind that settles into every corner of a room after someone has gone. My uncle had said the words softly, she left too soon, but she left you ready, as though speaking them any louder might crack something fragile inside me. I nodded, but at the time I didn't understand what he meant. How could anyone be ready for absence? Her presence still lived in the small details she had left behind. A scarf folded neatly across the back of a chair, though she had meant to take it with her. The faint scent of her perfume clinging stubbornly to the hallway, like a memory refusing to fade. Even the sound of her laughter, low, unhurried, echoed in my mind whenever the house grew too quiet. Every little reminder carried a weight, not only of who she had been, but of the way she had quietly shaped the spaces she touched. I would catch myself lingering over the objects she had touched, a coffee mug with the smallest crack near the handle, the worn edges of a book she had read aloud from, her handwriting on a note left on the kitchen counter. None of them were grand gestures, and yet each detail seemed to hold a kind of intimacy. It was as though she had known, in some quiet way, that even her ordinary habits would matter once she was gone. In those early days after she left, I would replay moments in my head with a precision that bordered on obsession. The way her eyes softened whenever she listened, truly listened, when I spoke. The tilt of her head when she was amused. The warmth in her smile, not radiant like sunlight but steady like a fire in winter. She had carried herself with a grace that made the world feel calmer just by her being in it, and in her absence, that calmness felt ripped away. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. My uncle's words haunted me, yes, but also nudged me toward understanding. She hadn't only given me memories, she had left me tools, invisible lessons I was only beginning to recognize. She had taught me patience without calling it a lesson, simply by giving me her time. She had shown me how to pay attention to small details, not because they were impressive, but because they mattered. She had left me with an awareness of connection, of how two people could meet in the quiet, unremarkable spaces of life and find something extraordinary there. In that sense, maybe she had left me ready. Not ready for her absence, because that wound still ached too sharply. But ready, perhaps, to carry forward the tenderness she had given me, to see the world with the same care she had seen in me. Ready, though I didn't know it yet, to step into a story that was only just beginning. I still remember the first time I noticed her, not just saw her, but truly noticed. She was 33, though at the time the number meant little to me. What struck me was the way she carried herself, not with arrogance, but with a quiet assurance, as though she knew the world well enough to stop competing with it. Her presence wasn't loud or demanding, yet somehow it pulled me in, like gravity. Our first conversations were brief. Passing words exchanged in kitchens and living rooms, moments where she asked me questions that cut past the surface. She never asked the things people usually did, about grades, plans, or ambitions. Instead, she asked what I was reading, or why I looked away during certain conversations. She noticed details most people skipped over, and there was something disarming in that kind of attention. The first time her hand brushed mine, it was by accident. She was handing me a book, and her fingers grazed against my skin. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but it was enough to send a current through me. I tried to disguise my reaction with a quick smile, but my chest tightened, my pulse quickened. It wasn't desire in the obvious sense, it was awareness. A sudden, startling awareness that she wasn't just someone older, wiser, or beautiful in an unreachable way. She was human, standing close enough to touch, close enough to change the air I breathed. Of course, I knew the numbers. She was older, and I was younger. That knowledge hovered between us, unspoken, like a veil neither of us dared to lift. I caught myself wondering if she thought about it too, if she noticed the pause in my voice when I addressed her, the hesitation in my steps when I entered a room where she sat. I wondered if her glances carried the same curiosity mine did, or if I was imagining it all. There was one evening that etched itself into me. She was sitting by the window, the glow of the lamp softening her features, a book resting in her lap. I walked in, intending to say something ordinary, but the words caught in my throat. For a moment, all I could do was look, at the way her hair fell loose against her shoulders, the way she held herself as though she belonged in that quiet moment more than anywhere else. She noticed me watching. Instead of looking away, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that made me feel seen, but also unsettled. It was unsteady ground, that beginning. We were both careful, too careful, as though one misstep could send everything crumbling. Yet beneath the caution, something undeniable stirred. A quiet spark, fragile and unformed, but real enough to shift the way I saw her, the way I saw myself. And though I couldn't name it yet, that first encounter had already changed the path I was walking. Some connections are not built in grand declarations, but in the soft, unremarkable spaces of life, the kind most people overlook. With her, it was always like that. Quiet moments, stretched just long enough to feel significant, lingered with a weight I couldn't explain. I remember one afternoon when the rain began to fall against the windows. The sound was steady, like a rhythm meant to keep us anchored in the present. She was sitting beside me on the couch, a book in her hands. She didn't ask if I wanted to listen, she simply began to read aloud, her voice low and calm, carrying the cadence of someone who knew how to make silence feel like company. Her shoulder brushed mine, light at first, as though accidental. But she didn't move away. Neither did I. It wasn't bold or dramatic, just two people leaning close enough to feel the faint warmth of each other's presence. That small point of contact grew heavier the longer it lasted. I found myself listening less to the story she was reading and more to the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle lilt in her tone, the way her hair slipped across her cheek whenever she glanced down at the page. The room smelled faintly of rain carried in on the breeze, mixed with the scent of her shampoo, clean, understated, yet unmistakable. I realized I was memorizing it without meaning to, holding on to details that might otherwise be forgotten. Every sense seemed heightened when she was near. There were moments when our eyes would meet, brief but lingering, as if we were both caught wondering the same unspoken question. In those pauses, it felt like time bent slightly around us, stretching out each second until it became impossible to ignore what was left unsaid. She closed the book eventually, tucking it aside, and the silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the quiet assurance of shared space. I could feel her presence not just beside me, but around me, as though the whole room carried her energy. She shifted slightly, her arm brushing mine again, and this time I dared to lean closer, not much, just enough to let her know I didn't mind the closeness. Nothing about that evening would have seemed extraordinary to anyone else. Two people, a book, the rain. And yet, for me, it was the kind of moment that etched itself deep, a memory that lived not in the mind alone but in the body, the way warmth lingers, the way silence speaks. With her, even the quiet was alive. There's a certain kind of ache that comes from being so close to what you want, yet knowing you can't reach for it, not yet, maybe not ever. That's what it felt like with her in those days. The tension wasn't loud or obvious, it lived in the small pauses, in the seconds that lingered a little too long, in the things we didn't say. One evening, we walked along the river just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was cool, tinged with the earthy scent of water and fading light. She walked close enough that I could feel the gentle brush of her sleeve against mine with each step. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but charged, like a wire carrying current just beneath the surface. And then, it happened. Her hand slipped into the crook of my arm, so casually it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. The weight of her hand was light, steady, and in that moment, every muscle in my body seemed to become aware of her touch. My heartbeat quickened, and I found myself desperate to hold on to it, to freeze that small gesture and never let it go. I glanced down at her, searching for something in her expression. She smiled, but it wasn't carefree. It was the kind of smile that carried hesitation, as if she was allowing herself a moment of closeness while knowing she might regret it later. Her eyes betrayed something unspoken, something fragile. I wanted to reach for her hand, to entwine my fingers with hers, to promise her I wouldn't let the world judge us or pull us apart. But I couldn't. Not then. The weight of expectation, of age, of unspoken rules, pressed hard against both of us. When we finally stopped by the edge of the river, the sun had dipped low, painting the water in streaks of gold and rose. She let her hand linger on my arm for just a breath longer before pulling it back, folding her arms across her chest as though to shield herself from the cool evening air, or perhaps from me. I stayed silent, caught between the urge to speak and the fear of what words might unravel. That night, when I lay in bed, I replayed that simple gesture over and over, her hand resting so naturally against me, the warmth of her skin seeping through cloth, the quiet permission it seemed to offer. It wasn't a kiss, it wasn't an embrace, and yet it was enough to leave me restless, suspended between wanting and waiting. In that tension, I realized, lived both the beauty and the burden of what was growing between us. There comes a moment in every quiet closeness when words can no longer stay hidden. For us, it came on a night when the world outside seemed still, as though holding its breath for what needed to be said. We were sitting across from each other, a dim lamp casting soft pools of light that flickered against the walls. She wasn't reading, she wasn't smiling, she was simply watching the steam rise from her cup, her fingers tracing the rim as though searching for courage in its warmth. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, nearly fragile. "I never meant for this to matter so much," she said. It wasn't a confession flung into the air, it was a surrender, the kind that escapes only when someone has been carrying it too long. I felt my breath catch. There was a tremor in her hand as she set the cup aside, and when her gaze lifted to meet mine, her eyes held a vulnerability I had never seen from her before. She looked less like the composed woman who always knew where she belonged, and more like someone afraid of stepping too far into a place where she might not be welcome. Her fingers drifted across the table, uncertain at first, then lightly tracing the edge of my palm. That single touch was enough to send heat rushing through me, though her hand trembled as if she expected me to pull away. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I wonder if I'm too much, or not enough." Both at once. Her voice cracked on the last words, and for a moment I saw her not as the older, steady figure I admired, but as someone equally afraid of losing control. I didn't let her hand retreat. I turned my palm up, letting her fingers rest inside mine, and then drew her hand gently toward my chest. Her skin was warm against me, her pulse quick, unsteady. "Listen," I told her softly, pressing her palm against my heart. The steady rhythm of my heartbeat filled the silence. "Do you hear that? That's not hesitation. That's not doubt. That's me." Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to respond, but no words came. Instead, her eyes softened, glistening in the low light, and I felt her exhale, slow, shaky, but real. She didn't need to speak. Her fingers curled slightly against my chest, as if holding on. In that moment, I understood that love, even when unnamed, is not always about certainty. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay in the tremor, to let vulnerability be shared rather than hidden. For her, it was a confession. For me, it was a vow I hadn't yet spoken aloud, that I would carry her fears as gently as I carried her hand. Goodbyes rarely come the way we expect. They don't arrive with clear endings or tidy explanations, they creep in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments until suddenly you realize the air has changed. That was how it happened with her. She told me she had to leave on an evening that began like any other. The room was soft with lamplight, the faint hum of life carrying on outside. She sat across from me, but I could sense it before she even spoke, the weight of something unsaid pressing between us. When her lips parted, the words came gently, almost apologetically. "I can't stay." For a long moment, I didn't move. The world seemed to narrow into the space between us. I searched her eyes for an explanation, for something I could hold on to. She looked away, her hands twisting together in her lap. Life, it's pulling me in a direction I can't resist, she said, her voice uneven. And if I don't go now, I'm afraid I'll never be able to. I wanted to argue, to plead, to tell her that no direction mattered more than this, than us, whatever we were. But her expression stopped me. There was sadness there, yes, but also resolve, a quiet strength that said the choice had already been made long before this night. When she finally stood, I rose too, instinctively, as though afraid that if I stayed seated, I'd lose her faster. She stepped close, close enough that the familiar scent of her perfume filled the air between us. Without hesitation, her arms slipped around me. Her embrace wasn't hurried or fleeting, it was lingering, deliberate, as if she wanted to carve the memory into both of us. Her cheek rested lightly against my chest, and I could feel her breath, unsteady, trembling with each exhale. My arms tightened around her, memorizing the shape of her shoulders beneath my hands, the way her body leaned into mine as though it belonged there. For a moment, the rest of the world vanished, leaving only the fragile rhythm of her heartbeat against me. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly broke, she whispered, "You'll be ready." The words cracked as they left her, a mix of conviction and grief. I held her tighter, but she didn't stay. Slowly, gently, she pulled back, her hands slipping from me like water through fingers. I didn't follow her to the door. I stood still, rooted, as she walked away. The click of the latch behind her sounded louder than thunder. The room was silent again, but not empty. Her absence pressed against me heavier than her presence ever had, a silence filled with everything we hadn't said. And yet, beneath the ache, her words echoed, "You'll be ready." I didn't believe them then. But I carried them, because they were all I had left of her. After she left, I drifted through the days as though half awake, carrying her absence like a shadow that never lifted. Rooms felt too quiet, conversations too thin. I tried to fill the silence with routine, but no matter what I did, she lingered, in the way my thoughts circled back to her voice, in the ghost of her touch still pressed against my skin. It was my uncle who finally broke through. He found me one afternoon sitting out on the porch, staring at the fields without really seeing them. He lowered himself into the chair beside me, his movements slow, steady, as though he had all the time in the world. For a while, he didn't speak, and I was grateful. But then, in that thoughtful tone of his, he said, "She left too soon. But she left you ready." The words landed heavy at first, almost cruel. Ready? How could I be ready when every part of me felt unfinished without her? But his eyes, kind and knowing, held me steady. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Those words were enough to begin unraveling something inside me. That night, lying awake, I thought of her not as someone who had abandoned me, but as someone who had given me more than I realized. She had taught me how to listen, not just with my ears, but with my whole being. She had shown me how to hold space for another person's fears, how to recognize the quiet strength hidden in vulnerability. She had taught me patience in the simplest ways, in the way she lingered over books, in the pauses she allowed in conversation, in her willingness to sit with silence until it became meaningful. I realized then that she had never left me empty. She had left me with a blueprint for tenderness, one I didn't know I was carrying until she was gone. Even her goodbye, as painful as it had been, was a gift, a reminder that love is not measured only in permanence, but in the way it shapes you to be gentler, braver, more open. The ache didn't disappear overnight. I still missed her, the way she smiled without needing words, the way her presence softened the hardest days. But alongside the ache was gratitude. Gratitude that I had known her, that she had seen me when I was still learning to see myself, that she had left me better than she found me. And so, when I remember her now, it isn't with despair. It's with a quiet warmth, the kind that stays long after the fire burns out. My uncle was right. She left too soon. But she left me ready. Ready to love, to listen, to carry forward the tenderness she entrusted to me. Ready, somehow, for the life that was still unfolding ahead.